December 11, 1978. Building 261, Lufthansa Cargo Terminal, John F. Kennedy International Airport. Kerry Whalen never saw the gun until it was pressed against his temple. The Lufthansa cargo supervisor had been doing paperwork when the door to his office exploded inward, and suddenly his Monday morning shift became something else entirely. 6 men in ski masks. They knew exactly where the security office was. They knew which supervisor had the combination. They'd done their homework. Nobody in that room could have imagined what was actually happening. Nearly $6 million in untraceable bills and jewels vanished into the pre-dawn darkness of Queens in less than 64 minutes. No alarms, no police response until it was over. Just empty steel shelves where stacks of currency had sat hours before, and a handful of terrified workers trying to process what had just happened. The mathematics of the crime were staggering. 10 men involved in the execution. Months of surveillance and planning. A 24-hour window when German currency sat in that vault, waiting for Monday morning conversion. The thieves had timed it perfectly. They'd studied the shift changes, the security rotations, the precise moment when maximum cash met minimum protection. This wasn't desperation or opportunity. This was orchestration. But the Lufthansa heist became something more than just another robbery. What happened after, the paranoia, the bodies, the systematic elimination of people connected to the crime, that's what made it unforgettable. Over the next 2 years, associates of the heist started disappearing or turning up dead, one by one. This is the story of how a carefully planned crime turned into a nightmare. How nearly $6 million in cash became connected to a trail of bodies, and how a cargo heist at a German airline terminal in New York exposed the violent world of organized crime in America during the late 1970s. But to understand what happened in Building 261 that December morning, you need to understand what America looked like in the late 70s. New York City, January 1, 1978. Dick Clark smiling through another New Year's rockin' Eve, while below Times Square, a different reality was setting in. The greatest city in the world was broke, scared, and running on fumes. Walk down any street in the 5 boroughs that winter and you saw it. Boarded windows in the South Bronx, entire blocks that looked like Dresden after the firebombing. Graffiti covering every subway car, transforming the underground into a moving canvas of defiance and decay. 42% of the streetlights in Brooklyn didn't work. The city had literally run out of money to replace the bulbs. When darkness fell, whole neighborhoods went dark with it. This wasn't the New York of the 60s when Manhattan was the center of American culture and prosperity. This wasn't even the scrappy surviving New York of the early 70s, when people still believed the downturn was temporary. By 1978, something fundamental had shifted. The city had looked over the edge of bankruptcy in 1975, seen the abyss staring back, and barely pulled itself away from the precipice. President Ford had told the city to drop dead. The Daily News had made it front-page news. New York survived, but the experience left scars. The numbers told the story. Unemployment in the city hovered around 9%, but in neighborhoods like Brownsville and East New York, it was closer to 20%. Manufacturing jobs that had sustained working-class families for generations were evaporating. Between 1970 and 1977, New York lost more than 600,000 jobs. 600,000. That's entire industries vanishing, factories closing. The economic engine that had built the greatest metropolis in America sputtering towards silence. And it wasn't just New York. The whole country was reeling. Inflation was climbing toward double digits. Gas lines from the energy crisis had Americans waiting hours just to fill their tanks. The Vietnam War was over, but the bitter taste lingered. Watergate had shattered faith in government. The American dream that had sustained the nation through depression and war was looking increasingly like a lie told to keep people working jobs that no longer existed. In Queens, in the neighborhoods around JFK Airport, you could see the pressure building. These were working people. Longshoremen, cargo handlers, truck drivers, airport employees grinding through night shifts to keep food on the table. Union jobs that used to mean security, a pension, a future. But by '78, those jobs were under siege. Automation was coming. Deregulation was coming. The old arrangements between labor and management were breaking down. Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park became a sanctuary for men caught in the squeeze. The bar sat on Leyfert's Boulevard, unremarkable from the outside, but inside it was something else. This was where cargo workers from the airport went to drink, to gamble, to make the side deals that supplemented wages that hadn't kept pace with inflation. This was where truck drivers met the men who could make freight manifests disappear, who could turn a blind eye to missing cartons, who could transform an airport job into something that paid real money. This was Jimmy Burke's kingdom. James Burke, known to everyone as Jimmy the Gent for his habit of tipping generously, was an associate of the Lucchese crime family. Not made, couldn't be, his father was Irish, but connected enough to matter, respected enough to command. Burke understood something fundamental about New York in 1978. He understood that desperation creates opportunity. He understood that when legitimate paths to prosperity close, men start looking for alternative routes. And he understood that Kennedy Airport, with its daily flow of international cargo and currency, was the biggest opportunity of them all. The airport economy in '78 was its own universe. 20 million passengers a year moving through terminals. Cargo planes arriving from Europe carrying everything from electronics to diamonds to cash. Lufthansa alone processed millions in currency transfers. Deutschmarks converted to dollars, the lifeblood of international commerce. All of it sitting in warehouses and vault rooms protected by security that hadn't been updated in a decade, monitored by workers making $12 an hour. Burke had been stealing from the airport for years. Small stuff mostly. Lifted cargo, hijacked trucks, the occasional significant score when opportunity presented. But he was always thinking bigger. Always watching for the one job that would set him up for life. The score that would let him retire from the constant grind of stealing and killing and looking over his shoulder. In the broader context of American crime in 1978, the mob was changing. The old mafia families that had controlled American organized crime since Prohibition were under unprecedented pressure. The FBI had shifted focus after J. Edgar Hoover's death, finally acknowledging that organized crime wasn't a communist conspiracy, but a real systemic threat. RICO statutes were giving prosecutors tools to take down entire organizations. Informants were starting to flip, breaking the code of silence that had protected the families for generations. But the money was still flowing. Gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, the traditional rackets were still generating millions. And increasingly drugs. The heroin trade that had been a side business in the 50s and 60s was becoming central to mob operations. The French connection had been broken, but new supply routes were opening through Sicily and South America. Burke himself wasn't directly involved in narcotics, but many of his associates were, and that money was transforming the crime landscape. For working men caught in the economic squeeze, the mob represented something complicated. Yes, they were criminals. Yes, they were violent. But they were also employers, lenders of last resort, the guys who could get you work when the union couldn't. They existed in the gray zone between legitimate and illegitimate commerce, and in neighborhoods where legitimate opportunities were disappearing, that gray zone kept expanding. The culture of 1978 reflected the tensions. Movies like Saturday Night Fever and The Godfather had made New York working-class life glamorous, but the reality was grittier. Disco was peaking. Studio 54 was the center of Manhattan nightlife, but most New Yorkers couldn't afford the cover charge. The Yankees had won the World Series, but attendance was down because people couldn't afford tickets. The city was simultaneously famous and broke, glamorous and desperate. For men like Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo worker drowning in gambling debts, this was the environment that made the impossible seem reasonable. Werner worked in Building 261. He knew the security systems, the shift rotations, the days when maximum cash sat in the vault. He knew that on Monday mornings, Lufthansa held currency transfers from weekend flights, millions in bills waiting for banks to open. And he knew that the security protecting that money was minimal, designed for an era when stealing from an airport seemed unthinkable. Werner also knew Jimmy Burke, knew him from Robert's Lounge, from the gambling operations Burke ran, from the debts Werner owed that kept climbing. And sometime in 1978, desperation met opportunity, and a conversation started that would end with the largest cash robbery in American history, and a body count that would shock even hardened mobsters. The 70s were supposed to be about liberation, about breaking free from the constraints of the 50s and 60s. And in some ways they were. But for working people in New York, for families watching their neighborhoods collapse and their prospects evaporate, the 70s were about something else. They were about survival, about making it through another year in a city that seemed to be dying, about finding a way to stay alive when the old rules no longer applied. This was the world that created the Lufthansa Heist. Not the glamorous mob world of movies and television, but the desperate, grinding reality of New York in 1978, a city on the edge, a country losing faith, men making terrible choices because the alternative looked worse. The planning began in the summer of '78. Louis Werner, sweating through his shirt in the Lufthansa cargo office, watching another Monday morning cash delivery and thinking about the $50,000 he owed to bookies who weren't known for their patience. He'd been working at the airport for years, grinding through night shifts, and he'd seen plenty of scores go down. Everybody who worked cargo knew the game. You looked the other way, you got paid. You helped things disappear, you got a taste. But Werner was thinking bigger now. He was thinking about the vault. He brought it to a small-time crook named Martin Krugman. Krugman ran a beauty salon, which was funny because there was nothing beautiful about the man's real business. Bookmaking, mostly, some loan sharking on the side. But Krugman knew people, and more importantly, he knew Jimmy Burke. And when Werner laid out what he knew about the Lufthansa operation, about the millions that sat unguarded in Building 261 every Monday morning, Krugman saw his commission. Burke's first reaction was skepticism. He'd heard 100 airport schemes, and most of them were nonsense dreamed up by wannabes who watched too many movies. But Werner's information was specific. He knew the exact configuration of the vault room. He knew which supervisor had the combination. He knew the shift changes, the security gaps, the precise window when they'd be most vulnerable. This wasn't fantasy. This was actionable intelligence. Burke started doing his own reconnaissance, sent people to watch the cargo terminal, to clock the security patterns, to verify Werner's information. Everything checked out. Better than that, the security was even weaker than Werner had described. One unarmed guard at night. No cameras inside the vault area. Alarm systems that looked like they'd been installed when Eisenhower was president. The place was practically begging to be robbed. But Burke understood something Werner didn't. A score this big required serious talent. Professional burglars who could move fast and stay cool. Guys who wouldn't panic, wouldn't start shooting, wouldn't do anything stupid that would bring down heat. He needed his crew. First was Tommy DeSimone. 28 years old, 5'6", and probably the most dangerous man in Queens. DeSimone was a made man in the Lucchese family, a stone killer who'd racked up bodies since his teens. Burke trusted him absolutely, which says something about Burke. DeSimone was unstable, violent, paranoid, but he was loyal and he was competent. If things went sideways, Tommy would handle it. Then there was Angelo Sepe, a professional burglar, hijacker, and armed robber. Sepe had been knocking over trucks and warehouses for years. He knew how to crack locks, disable alarms, move through a building like a ghost. He was also DeSimone's best friend, which meant he was probably just as dangerous. Joe Manri was another professional thief. His brother-in-law, Paolo LiCastri, would drive one of the getaway vehicles. Frank Mena, cargo hijacker with airport connections. Louis Cafora, who ran a successful body shop in Brooklyn, but had been involved in hijacking operations for years. Cafora would drive the main truck used to transport the stolen cash. Burke needed one more specialist. Someone who could handle the vault work, who knew alarm systems and locks. He found him through mob connections. Tony Rodriguez, a burglar from uptown who'd worked bank jobs. The crew met through October and November at Robert's Lounge. Burke laid out the plan. They'd go in at 3 a.m., right after the shift change. Minimal personnel, maximum cash. They'd wear masks, carry weapons, but use them only for intimidation. No shooting unless absolutely necessary. They'd round up the workers, force the supervisor to open the vault, load everything into a cargo van, and be gone before the next shift arrived at 6. Simple, clean, professional. Werner provided detailed diagrams of the cargo terminal, which doors would be unlocked, where the break room was located, the path from the employee entrance to the vault, the location of the one working alarm system and how to avoid triggering it. He told them that the supervisor with the vault combination was Kerry Whalen, and that Whalen could be intimidated. He wasn't a hero. Put a gun to his head and he'd cooperate. The date was set. December 11th, the Monday after a busy weekend of flights from Germany. Werner confirmed that a major currency transfer would be sitting in the vault. Maybe $4 million, possibly more. Burke calculated the splits. 10 men involved directly or indirectly. That was $600,000 per man at minimum. The biggest score of his life. December 11th, 1978, 3:12 a.m. 2 vehicles approached Building 261. A black cargo van stolen from a rental company, license plates switched, and a car carrying the backup crew. The temperature was 28 degrees, the sky clear, the airport quiet between the late-night arrivals and early morning departures. Burke wasn't there. That was crucial. The boss never went on the jobs. Burke stayed at Robert's Lounge, establishing his alibi, waiting for the phone call that would tell him whether he was rich or dead. DeSimone led the crew. 6 men in ski masks, guns drawn, moving through the employee entrance that Werner had promised would be unlocked. It was. They moved fast through the corridor, surprising a cargo worker in the hallway, forcing him to the ground. Then into the office area where Whalen sat doing paperwork. The gun to Whalen's head was almost gentle. DeSimone's voice was calm, professional. Open the vault. Do it now. No heroes, no alarms. Just open it, and everyone goes home alive. Whalen was shaking as he led them to the vault room. The combination worked on the first try. The heavy door swung open, and there it was, stack after stack of currency, American bills bound in neat bundles. Beyond that, a separate secure area holding jewels and jewelry, another score they hadn't even expected. For 64 minutes, the crew worked with machine efficiency, loading cash into canvas bags, clearing the vault systematically. No talking beyond necessary instructions. The workers were bound and left in the break room, told not to move, not to touch the phone, not to be heroes. The thieves had already made clear that cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant something else. At 4:16 a.m., the cargo van pulled away from Building 261. $6 million. The actual total was even more than Werner had predicted. $5 million in cash, another $1 million in jewelry, the largest cash robbery in American history, and it had gone off without a single shot fired. The van drove to a prearranged location in Canarsie, a desolate warehouse district in Brooklyn. There, they transferred everything to several smaller vehicles. The stolen van would be dumped, wiped clean, torched. The crew would split up, taking different routes to the counting location Burke had established. By 7 a.m., they were long gone, and Kerry Whalen was giving his statement to Port Authority Police, describing 6 masked men who'd moved like professionals and disappeared like ghosts. The FBI was notified by 8 a.m. This wasn't some amateur crew. The planning, the timing, the execution, everything pointed to a professional operation, likely connected to organized crime. At Robert's Lounge, Jimmy Burke was counting money. Nearly $6 million had been stolen. There would be shares to divide, bosses to pay off. Everyone involved would get their cut. But 10 people knew about the heist, and over the coming months that would become a problem. Louis Werner made his first mistake 11 days after the heist. December 22, 1978. He walked into a travel agency in Queens and paid cash for airline tickets to Colombia. Over $2,000 in crisp bills, fresh from the bank. Werner didn't have a bank account that could explain that kind of money. The travel agent remembered the transaction. The FBI was already investigating Werner. He was a Luftansa employee with gambling debts and connections to people of interest. When agents interviewed the travel agent during their investigation, she mentioned the cargo worker who'd paid cash for expensive tickets right after the robbery. Werner was arrested on January 10, 1979. But Werner's arrest didn't break the case. He refused to cooperate. He said nothing about other participants. The FBI had evidence he'd been involved, probably as the inside man, but connecting him to others proved difficult. They needed more witnesses. They needed the crew to make mistakes. They needed someone to talk. Meanwhile, people connected to the heist started dying. The first was Joanna Cafora. She was married to Louis Cafora, who'd been involved in the heist. On February 6, 1979, Joanna Cafora disappeared. Her body was never found. 2 weeks later, Louis Cafora's body turned up in a car at a Brooklyn motel, frozen, shot multiple times. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who'd helped connect Louis Werner to the robbery plan, vanished on January 6th. His wife reported him missing. Police investigated. They found no body, no evidence, no leads. Krugman had disappeared completely. A pattern emerged. People connected to the heist who might become problems began disappearing or turning up dead. Paolo LiCastri, one of the drivers, was killed. Frank Mena was found dead in his car. Joe Manri and his girlfriend were murdered. Angelo Sepe and his girlfriend were murdered. Over the next 2 years, most of the people involved in planning or executing the heist died violently. The FBI investigated these murders. They documented the pattern. But connecting the killings directly to the heist proved difficult. Burke was brought in for questioning repeatedly. He answered through his lawyer, denied any knowledge of the robbery or the violence. Without witnesses willing to testify, without physical evidence, the case stalled. And then, Tommy DeSimone disappeared. January 14, 1979. DeSimone, who had led the heist crew, was supposed to be formally initiated into the Lucchese family. He went to the meeting and never came back. His body was never found. Burke continued to deny any involvement. The FBI brought him in for questioning repeatedly. They had strong suspicions about his role in masterminding the heist and ordering the murders, but proving it in court was another matter. Burke answered questions through his lawyer, maintaining his innocence. The money disappeared into the underground economy, nearly $6 million scattered through countless transactions. Some likely went to Burke's superiors in the Lucchese crime family. Some went into legitimate businesses that could launder the cash. The FBI traced some leads, but most of the money was never recovered. Werner went to trial in March 1979. The evidence included his financial records showing gambling debts and money problems, his access to the cargo terminal, and his connections to people of interest. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Even facing prison time, Werner refused to identify other participants. The investigation became one of the largest in FBI history. Dozens of agents worked the case, following thousands of leads, interviewing hundreds of witnesses. They built a massive case file documenting Burke's criminal activities and his connections to the Lucchese crime family. But they couldn't connect him directly to the Lufthansa heist. Key witnesses were dead. Physical evidence was limited. In 1980, Burke was arrested on an unrelated charge: conspiracy to fix college basketball games at Boston College. The evidence was substantial. Burke was convicted in 1982 and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Henry Hill, facing his own legal problems, made a significant decision. He became a government informant. He went to the FBI and began cooperating, providing information about Burke, organized crime operations, and various criminal activities. Hill hadn't been part of the Lufthansa heist crew, so he couldn't provide direct testimony about the robbery itself. But he had knowledge about the planning, the aftermath, and related criminal activities. His cooperation would later form the basis for the book Wise Guy and the film Goodfellas. Burke went to prison in 1982. While serving his sentence, he was indicted for murder in an unrelated case. He was convicted and received a life sentence in 1985. Burke died in prison in 1996, never having been formally charged with the Lufthansa heist. The money was never recovered. Nearly $6 million in cash gone. Some was likely spent immediately by crew members before they were killed. Some may still be hidden in locations that were never revealed. Some was probably laundered through various businesses over time, transformed from stolen cash into seemingly legitimate assets. The jewelry stolen in the heist proved difficult to trace. Some pieces turned up in pawn shops over the years. Most was never recovered and may have been melted down to eliminate identifying characteristics. For the families of the victims, the aftermath brought lasting pain. Joanna Cafora, Martin Krugman, and others connected to the case disappeared, their bodies never found. The murders were investigated, but prosecutions proved difficult. Families lived with unanswered questions. The Lufthansa heist became part of organized crime lore. It was the largest cash robbery in American history at the time, but it also resulted in the deaths of most people involved. The case demonstrated the risks of large criminal conspiracies. The Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK installed significantly improved security after 1978. Cameras, additional guards, and better vault systems became standard. The heist exposed serious vulnerabilities in airport cargo operations and led to comprehensive security reforms at major airports across America. For New York in the late 70s and early 80s, the murders connected to Lufthansa were part of a broader pattern of violence. The city averaged over 1,800 murders per year during this period. Individual mob killings rarely made front-page news. The Lufthansa heist occurred during a significant period in the federal government's approach to organized crime. The FBI investigation documented not just the robbery itself, but the broader criminal network that made it possible. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, had been passed in 1970. This law gave prosecutors new tools to charge entire criminal enterprises, not just individual criminals. By the late 1970s, federal prosecutors were beginning to use RICO more effectively in organized crime cases. The Luftansa investigation documented Burke's connections to the Lucchese crime family, the network of airport workers involved in criminal activity, and related loan sharking and gambling operations. This documentation would contribute to broader organized crime investigations in the 1980s. When Henry Hill began cooperating with authorities in 1980, he provided extensive information about organized crime operations. His testimony wasn't limited to Lufthansa. He couldn't testify directly about the heist since he wasn't part of the crew. But he provided information about how organized crime families operated, how they controlled unions, how they infiltrated legitimate businesses, and how violence was used in criminal enterprises. In 1985, federal prosecutors brought what became known as the Commission Case, using RICO to indict leaders of New York's major crime families simultaneously. This marked a significant shift in how organized crime was prosecuted. Several high-ranking mobsters received lengthy prison sentences. The Lufthansa investigation contributed to this broader effort. It demonstrated that even carefully planned, organized crime operations would leave evidence and connections that could be documented and investigated over time. The heist also influenced public understanding of organized crime. The initial media coverage focused on the audacity of the robbery. Nearly $6 million stolen from a major airport terminal. The crew had been professional, and initially no one was hurt during the robbery itself. It had elements that made for dramatic crime reporting. But as bodies connected to the heist began appearing over the following months and years, the narrative shifted. The violence, the disappearances, the systematic elimination of people involved painted a different picture of organized crime. The 1990 film Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese and based on Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, portrayed the Lufthansa heist and its aftermath. The film showed organized crime as a world of violence and paranoia, where success often led to elimination. The movie helped shape public understanding of this period in organized crime history. For law enforcement and criminologists, Lufthansa became a case study. The planning had been detailed, and the execution was nearly flawless. But the aftermath showed the inherent instability of large criminal conspiracies. With 10 people involved in planning or executing the robbery, maintaining operational security proved impossible. Most participants died violently within 2 years. This observation influenced subsequent organized crime investigations. Rather than focusing solely on individual crimes, investigators began mapping criminal networks, identifying relationships, and applying strategic pressure. Success rates in organized crime prosecutions improved through the 1980s and 1990s. The economic context of the heist also drew attention. The Lufthansa robbery happened because cargo workers with access to valuable shipments were vulnerable to criminal recruitment. Louis Werner had gambling debts and financial pressures. His position at Lufthansa gave him detailed knowledge of security procedures and cash movements. This combination created the opportunity for the crime. Airport security improved significantly after Lufthansa. Background checks became more thorough. Security cameras became standard. Access controls were tightened. These reforms extended beyond John F. Kennedy to other major airports and high-value facilities across the country. The vulnerabilities that made the heist possible were systematically addressed. Labor unions that had been infiltrated by organized crime also saw reforms over the following decades. though this was a gradual process extending well beyond the Lufthansa case itself. Federal prosecutions using RICO helped remove organized crime influence from some unions. The Lufthansa heist remains part of American crime history. It was the largest cash robbery in the country at that time. The fact that Burke was never formally charged for it, that most of the money was never recovered, and that many questions remain unanswered has contributed to ongoing interest in the case. Stories and speculation continue about what happened to the missing millions. It's possible that someone involved managed to keep a portion of the money and avoid detection. With 10 people initially involved and the rapid elimination of most participants, it's conceivable that someone survived with their share intact. However, this remains speculation. What's documented is that most participants died violently, and Burke died in prison. The significance of the Lufthansa heist extends beyond the unsolved mystery. The case revealed aspects of organized crime in New York during the late 1970s. It showed how criminal networks operated, how they infiltrated legitimate businesses like airports, and the violence used to maintain control. The heist occurred during a transitional period when federal law enforcement was developing more effective tools to combat organized crime. Vincent Asaro didn't expect to face charges for Luftansa, not after 36 years, not after most witnesses were dead or disappeared, not after the FBI had moved on to other priorities. But in 2014, at 80 years old, Asaro, a captain in the Bonanno crime family, was indicted on charges related to the 1978 heist. The charges came from cooperating witnesses who claimed Asaro had been involved in planning the heist and had received proceeds from it. After more than 3 decades, the largest cash robbery in American history at that time was back in federal court. The trial in 2015 was notable. Elderly organized crime figures testified. FBI agents presented evidence gathered decades earlier. Prosecutors attempted to prove a case about a crime from 1978. The defense challenged the credibility of witnesses who were themselves admitted criminals and who had waited decades to come forward. The jury returned a verdict: not guilty. After all the time, after all the investigation, Asaro was acquitted. The prosecution's case, built on decades-old evidence and testimony from cooperating witnesses with their own criminal histories, did not convince the jury beyond reasonable doubt. The acquittal demonstrated the challenges of prosecuting organized crime cases, especially decades after the fact. Even with cooperating witnesses and accumulated evidence, establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt remained difficult. The traditional code of silence in organized crime, while weakened over time, still protected some secrets. But the trial also showed the persistence of federal law enforcement. The fact that charges were brought more than 36 years after the crime demonstrated that these investigations continue over decades. Files remain open. New information is evaluated. Authorities wait for opportunities when witnesses decide to cooperate. For people who lived in Queens during 1978 and 1979, the Lufthansa heist and its aftermath remain a significant memory. They remember the news reports, the speculation, the bodies that were found. The fear that ran through neighborhoods where organized crime had influence was real. Many people understood what was happening but didn't speak openly about it. That culture has changed significantly. Younger generations in Queens today are largely unaware of the names Burke or DeSimone. They didn't experience the period when organized crime had substantial influence over aspects of working-class life. The social clubs and gathering places associated with that era are mostly gone. Robert's Lounge closed long ago. Many of the men who frequented such places are deceased, imprisoned, or living elsewhere. Kennedy Airport itself has changed dramatically. Building 261, the Lufthansa cargo terminal where the heist occurred, has been demolished and rebuilt. Security that was inadequate in 1978 is now comprehensive. Cameras are everywhere. Armed security personnel are standard. Background checks and security clearances are required for airport employees. Access control systems track movement throughout secure areas. The specific vulnerabilities that enabled the Lufthansa heist have been eliminated, but economic pressures that can make people vulnerable to criminal recruitment still exist. Working people still face financial stress. Wages don't always keep pace with living costs. The pressure of bills and debts remains a reality for many families. The temptation to take shortcuts or accept money from questionable sources hasn't disappeared. These are persistent aspects of economic life. The difference is that organized crime no longer has the infrastructure it once had to exploit these vulnerabilities. The influence that criminal organizations had in the 1970s has been significantly reduced. They still exist and still operate, but not with the systematic power they once wielded. They can't offer the kind of alternative economy they provided in the 70s. The old arrangements have largely broken down. Criminal activity has evolved. Street gangs, drug trafficking organizations, and cybercriminals operating internationally represent current forms of organized crime. But none of these have achieved the cultural penetration or systematic organization that the American mafia had at its peak. A heist like Luftansa would be much more difficult today, not necessarily because individuals are more honest, but because the criminal infrastructure and security vulnerabilities that made it possible no longer exist in that form. For law enforcement, Luftansa remains an important case study. The investigation was extensive and largely successful in documenting the crime and the criminal network behind it. But prosecutions were frustrated for years by familiar challenges. Witnesses who wouldn't testify, evidence that was circumstantial, the code of silence that protected participants. The approaches that eventually showed results included patience and sustained pressure. Waiting for criminal organizations to develop internal conflicts, using RICO statutes to charge criminal enterprises rather than just individuals, offering cooperation agreements to lower-level participants who were willing to testify, building cases methodically over years and decades. These methods weren't fast, but they produced results over time. Retired FBI agents who worked on Lufthansa sometimes discuss the case. They describe the frustration of having strong suspicions about who was responsible, but facing challenges in proving it in court. They recall Burke's confidence during interrogations. They remember the families of victims seeking justice that often proved elusive. And they maintain that despite the frustrations, despite Burke never being convicted specifically for Lufthansa, the investigation had value. The investigation mattered because it documented the operations of organized crime. It created connections and patterns that were used in subsequent prosecutions. It demonstrated that criminal operations could be penetrated, documented, and investigated over extended periods. Lufthansa was part of a larger effort against organized crime, and that broader effort achieved significant results over time. For the families of victims, closure has been difficult to find. Joanna Cafora and Martin Krugman were never found. Others who died in connection with the case were buried or disposed of in ways that left few traces. These families live with unanswered questions and the knowledge that those responsible largely avoided prosecution specifically for these deaths. The lack of clear resolution has been the hardest aspect for many, not just the deaths themselves, but the limited accountability. However, there is a record of consequences. Burke died in federal prison while serving a life sentence. Most crew members who survived the initial violence were later prosecuted for other crimes and served prison time or died under violent circumstances. The money disappeared, but so did any real opportunity to enjoy it. In the end, few if any participants benefited from the heist. 47 years since 6 masked men entered Building 261 and left with nearly $6 million. The world has changed dramatically since then. Technology has transformed daily life. The political landscape is unrecognizable. The organized crime families that dominated New York in the 1970s have been significantly weakened through prosecution and social changes. But the Lufthansa heist remains notable in American crime history. It was the largest cash robbery in the country at that time. Not the biggest theft overall, that distinction belongs to various financial frauds. But the largest physical robbery where armed individuals took cash and valuables in a single operation, that remains Luftansa. The outcomes for participants were severe. Nearly everyone involved in the heist died violently or ended up in prison. The money disappeared into the underground economy, scattered and mostly unrecovered. Whatever glory existed lasted briefly before violence and fear dominated. The crew that executed the robbery largely eliminated each other over the proceeds. There are no clear winners in this story. The case illustrates the risks of criminal conspiracies. Economic pressure combined with criminal opportunity led ordinary people to make choices with devastating consequences. Louis Werner thought he was solving his gambling debts. The crew thought they were securing their financial futures. Burke thought he could control the aftermath through violence. All of these calculations proved wrong. The real significance of Luftansa lies in what it revealed about organized crime in New York during the late 1970s. The casual corruption that allowed the heist to happen, the systematic infiltration of legitimate businesses by criminal organizations, the economic pressures that made working people vulnerable to recruitment, all of these factors have largely changed, not because human nature has improved, but because systems evolved. Law enforcement developed better tools and strategies. Organized crime's influence weakened. The economy changed. The specific circumstances that enabled Lufthansa haven't realigned in the same way, but human tendencies remain constant. Greed, fear, desperation, the willingness to rationalize poor choices, the belief that circumstances will be different this time, that you're smarter than those who came before, that you can succeed where others failed. These factors don't change. They're enduring aspects of human behavior, which means somewhere, someone may be planning an ambitious crime, convinced they'll succeed where everyone else has failed. History suggests otherwise. Most criminals are caught. Most stolen money is recovered or lost. Most elaborate schemes fall apart. The rare exceptions, like aspects of Lufthansa, become notable precisely because they're exceptional. But even Lufthansa, with its careful planning and execution, brought destruction to nearly everyone it touched. So, what remains? A case file in FBI offices, thousands of pages documenting a crime, an investigation, and a criminal network. A few lines in history books about the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. The memories of people who lived through it, though that generation is aging. The story of a carefully planned heist that became connected to violence and death, told and retold over decades. And somewhere, possibly, a portion of the money that was never recovered. If someone involved managed to take their share and disappear, if they resisted spending conspicuously, if they kept quiet for 47 years, they would be elderly now. Sitting on wealth they can never fully enjoy, perhaps still looking over their shoulder. That's one possible legacy of Lufthansa. The money came with consequences, and those consequences affected everyone connected to the heist. Kerry Whalen, the supervisor who opened the vault that December morning, lived the rest of his life with the memory of that night. He did what he was told under threat. He cooperated, he survived. But the experience stayed with him. That's another category of victim, the people who were present, who witnessed the crime, who carried the trauma without being compensated or fully acknowledged. The cargo workers who were restrained and threatened. The families of people who died in connection with the heist. The investigators who worked for years, building cases that often couldn't be fully prosecuted. The neighborhoods that lived under organized crime influence and witnessed people disappear. Luftansa affected hundreds of lives, and most of those individual stories were never fully told. This is what remains, the knowledge that in December 1978, 10 people executed a robbery that took nearly $6 million from Kennedy Airport. They planned carefully and executed professionally. And then the aftermath unraveled into violence. The money disappeared, and most participants died within 2 years. The investigation continued for decades. And in the end, the primary outcome was loss. That's the story, not just the heist itself, but what came after. Nearly $6 million, 10 people, 2 years of violence connected to the case, decades of investigation, and at the end, little to show for it, but documented history and the knowledge that criminal success often brings its own form of failure. Jimmy Burke planned and organized one of the most audacious robberies in American history. He died in federal prison, serving a life sentence, never formally charged with Luftansa. The FBI investigated for decades. They built extensive case files but couldn't prosecute Burke specifically for the heist. The crew that executed the robbery mostly died violently, and the money vanished. 47 years later, Luftansa stands as a monument to ambition and failure, to the American crime story at its most ambitious and most tragic. The largest cash robbery in American history, the greatest heist ever pulled, the perfect crime that destroyed everyone who touched it. That's the legacy. That's what remains. A cautionary tale about the cost of easy money and the price of broken loyalty. A story that belongs to another era, but speaks to eternal truths about human nature and the consequences of our choices. The vault in Building 261 is gone now, demolished and rebuilt into something modern and secure. But the memory persists. On December 11th every year, some FBI agents probably still think about it. Some old-timers in Queens definitely remember. And somewhere, maybe, someone counts out old bills and remembers the night they became rich and cursed in the same moment. That's Luftansa. That's the story. $6 million, 10 men, 2 years of violence, decades of investigation, and in the end, nothing to show for it but graves and legends and the knowledge that the perfect crime is a myth. Crime always costs more than it pays. The bill always comes due. And for the men who robbed Luftansa on that December morning in 1978, the bill came due in blood.